What's up, everyone? Hope everybody's having a great day. Today, we need to talk about something that's been driving aviation experts crazy since the Greg Biffle crash. The altitude data from that flight doesn't make sense. I mean, it really doesn't make sense. We've got tracking that shows the citation climbing from 1,800 feet to 4,000 feet in less than a minute. That's a 4,000 foot per minute climb rate. And a citation 2 that's supposedly having engine problems. Then suddenly the aircraft is back down low and crashing. These numbers are either showing us a massive struggle for control in that cockpit, or they're showing us something else entirely. And folks, when you understand what these altitude fluctuations might mean, when you realize what they tell us about those final, desperate minutes, the picture that emerges is absolutely terrifying. So let's start with what the data actually shows, because this is where things get really weird. Flight Radar 24, which most of us use to track flights, shows 24 data points over the 10-minute flight. Pretty normal stuff for the first couple of minutes. The aircraft takes off, climbs to about 2,000 feet, starts turning back toward the airport. But then there's a gap, a 4-minute gap where we get no data at all. And when the data comes back for that final position, the aircraft is low and about to crash. That's one version of the story. The cleaned-up, filtered version that Flight Radar 24 thinks is accurate. But then there's ADS-B Exchange. They show the raw, unfiltered data, and holy smokes is it different. According to their data, after that initial climb and turn, the aircraft suddenly rockets up to 4,000 feet. We're talking about a climb rate that would make a fighter jet proud. 4,000 feet per minute. In a Citation 2, at maximum weight, with reported engine problems. That's not just unusual. That's basically impossible. Unless something extraordinary was happening in that cockpit. Unless there was a desperate fight for control that we're only now beginning to understand. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Bad data, transponder malfunction, reception errors, and you might be right. The experts are divided on this. Some say it's definitely line-of-sight issues. The aircraft dropped below the horizon for certain receivers, and the system filled in bad data. Others say, no, this shows a desperate attempt to climb. Maybe they thought altitude would save them. Maybe they were trying to clear weather. Maybe they were fighting control forces we don't understand. The truth is, we don't know for sure. But either interpretation tells us something important about those final minutes. Let's talk about what a 4,000 foot per minute climb would mean physically in a Citation 2. First off, it would require both engines at absolute maximum power. Not cruise power, not climb power, but firewall everything you've got, emergency power, the kind of power settings you only use when your life depends on it. Second, it would require a very aggressive pitch attitude. We're talking about pulling back on the yoke hard enough to make passengers feel serious G-forces. Third, it would rapidly bleed airspeed. You're trading every bit of horizontal energy for vertical gain. It's the aviation equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. But here's the thing. If they really did attempt this radical climb, it suggests panic, or at least desperation. Experienced pilots like Dennis Dutton don't yank aircraft into 40-degree climb attitudes without a damn good reason. They don't firewall throttles and pull back hard unless something has gone very, very wrong. So if this data is real, if they really did rocket up to 4,000 feet, it tells us the situation in that cockpit was far worse than anyone has publicly acknowledged. It tells us they were fighting for their lives in ways we're only beginning to understand. Former NTSB investigator Tom Guzzetti has looked at this data, and his interpretation is chilling. He suggests the erratic altitude readings could indicate a struggle for control, not necessarily between people, but between the pilots and the aircraft itself. Maybe control surfaces weren't responding normally. Maybe trim was running away. Maybe the autopilot was fighting them. When you get these wild altitude excursions in the data, it often means the aircraft is doing things the pilots don't want it to do. And they're fighting back with everything they have. The timing of these altitude changes is crucial. The big climb, if it really happened, occurs about 4 minutes into the flight. That's after they've already declared an issue, after they've already turned back, after they've already committed to landing. So why would they suddenly climb? Why would they reverse course on their energy management? Why would they do something so contrary to what you'd expect unless they had no choice? Unless the aircraft was doing something that required an extreme response. Unless the situation had deteriorated beyond what the initial issue suggested. One theory, and this is speculation but informed speculation, is that they encountered severe turbulence or wind shear.
The weather that day was marginal. Low clouds, drizzle, potentially unstable air. If they hit a severe updraft, it could have pushed them up rapidly. The pilots might have had to push forward aggressively to stop the climb, then overcorrected and ended up diving. That could explain the wild altitude swings. It could explain why experienced pilots seem to lose control. It could explain why the data looks so chaotic. Another possibility is spatial disorientation. In clouds with no visual references, pilots can become confused about which way is up. It's killed many experienced aviators. If they entered clouds during their turnback, if they lost visual reference with the ground, if the instruments were giving confusing readings because of the emergency, they might have pulled back, thinking they were descending when they were actually climbing, then realized their mistake and pushed forward hard. That could create these dramatic altitude changes. It could explain why the flight path looks so erratic. But there's a darker possibility that some experts have quietly suggested. What if there was confusion about who was flying? What if Dennis and Jack were both trying to control the aircraft, not fighting each other, but both responding to what they thought was needed? In high-stress situations with unclear roles, this can happen. Both pilots pulling or pushing, creating control inputs that neither intends. It's called negative crew resource management, and it's killed people before. The altitude fluctuations could be the result of conflicting control inputs from two people trying to save the aircraft. The 4-minute data gap is particularly troubling. Flight Radar 24 filters out what it considers bad data. But what if that filtered data was actually showing us the truth? What if during those 4 minutes, the aircraft was doing things so unusual, so outside normal parameters, that the system said, "This can't be right," and deleted it? We might be missing the most crucial part of the flight, the part where everything went from bad to catastrophic, the part where a manageable emergency became an unrecoverable situation. Let me explain how ADS-B works because this matters for understanding the data. The aircraft's transponder broadcasts its position and altitude every second. Ground stations receive these broadcasts and forward them to tracking services. But here's the thing, the transponder gets its altitude from the aircraft's altimeter. If the altimeter is reading wrong, if the pitot-static system is compromised, if there's an instrument failure, the transponder will broadcast wrong data.
So these wild altitude swings might not represent what the aircraft was actually doing. They might represent what the instruments were telling the pilots the aircraft was doing. Think about that for a second. If the pilots were seeing the same erratic altitude indications we're seeing in the data, they would have been completely confused. Imagine trying to fly an emergency approach while your instruments are telling you you're climbing through 4,000 feet when you know you should be descending. Imagine trying to configure for landing when you can't trust your altitude. Imagine making life or death decisions based on information that might be completely wrong. That's a nightmare scenario that could explain everything. The radar data from Charlotte Approach Control would tell us the truth. Radar measures altitude independently from the aircraft's transponder. It would show what the aircraft was actually doing, not what it thought it was doing. But that data hasn't been released yet. The NTSB has it. They're analyzing it. Eventually, they'll tell us whether the citation really climbed to 4,000 feet or whether it was all instrument error. But for now, we're left with this confusing, contradictory data that raises more questions than answers. Some pilots who've analyzed the data think the climb to 4,000 feet was intentional, but not for the reasons you'd expect. They suggest the crew might have been trying to attempt a restart of a failed engine. In the Citation 2, the engine restart procedure works better at higher altitude where the air is thinner. Maybe they thought, if we can just get high enough, we can get this engine running again. So they climbed aggressively, hoping to create conditions for a restart. But the climb used up so much energy that when the restart didn't work, they had nothing left. The descent from 4,000 feet, if it happened, would have been terrifying. We're not talking about a controlled descent. We're talking about what pilots call an uncontrolled mush. The aircraft stalling but not diving, falling out of the sky like a leaf. The pilots pulling back on the controls but getting no response, the stall warning blaring. Everyone on board feeling that sickening sensation of falling, and all of this happening in clouds with no visual reference, no way to judge height above ground, just instruments that might be lying and a prayer that somehow they'd break out in time to recover. The filtered Flight Radar 24 data suggests a much simpler story. A gradual descent from 2,000 feet, some maneuvering to line up with the runway, a final descent that came up short.
That's the version most people have accepted. The version that makes sense. The version that fits with a crew dealing with an engine problem, trying to get back to the airport. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the approach was so unstable. It doesn't explain why they couldn't make the runway. It doesn't explain why experienced pilots failed to execute what should have been a manageable emergency landing. Here's what really bothers me about the altitude data. If the 4,000-foot climb is real, it means the crew had options they didn't use. At 4,000 feet, they could have glided much further. They could have made Charlotte Douglas Airport. They could have had time to properly configure. They could have declared a mayday and gotten vectors to a suitable runway. But they didn't do any of that.
Which suggests either the climb never happened, or it happened under circumstances that prevented them from capitalizing on it. Like they were out of control, like they were spatially disoriented, like they were fighting something we don't yet understand. The witnesses on the ground didn't report seeing the aircraft at 4,000 feet, but in those weather conditions with low clouds and poor visibility, they might not have been able to see it even if it was there. The only witness who would have known for sure was that Aztec pilot who took off right behind them. But their testimony hasn't been made public. Did they see the Citation climb rapidly? Did they see it disappear into clouds? Did they see it fall out of the sky? We don't know. That testimony exists, but it's locked away in NTSB files waiting for the final report. The engine failure theory doesn't fully explain the altitude fluctuations either. Even with one engine failed, a Citation II shouldn't exhibit such erratic altitude changes. The aircraft is certified for single-engine operations. It should be able to maintain altitude, or at least descend in a controlled manner. These wild swings suggest something more was wrong. Maybe both engines were having problems. Maybe there were control system failures. Maybe there were multiple emergencies happening simultaneously, each one making the others worse. Former Citation pilots who've looked at the data are divided. Some say it's clearly bad data. No Citation II could climb like that under those circumstances. Others say they've seen similar things when pilots panic. When faced with imminent death, people do extraordinary things. They pull back on controls with superhuman strength. They push engines beyond all limits. They attempt maneuvers that would never work because doing something feels better than doing nothing. The altitude data might be showing us raw human desperation translated into impossible flight parameters. The psychological factor can't be ignored here. Dennis Dutton was used to flying large Boeings with massive power reserves. In a moment of crisis, might he have reverted to Boeing muscle memory? Might he have pulled back expecting turbofan engines that could power through anything? The Citation's anemic engines wouldn't respond like Boeing engines, but in the heat of the moment, with alarms going off and people's lives at stake, rational thought sometimes fails. Training takes over, and if your training is in different aircraft, that training might make things worse, not better. There's also the possibility of a runaway trim situation. If the Citation's electric trim system malfunctioned if it started running nose up without command, it would force the aircraft to climb. The pilots would push forward on the yokes, trying to stop the climb, but electric trim is stronger than human arms. The aircraft would continue climbing until the trim either stopped or reached its limit. Then suddenly the pilots would have control again, but they'd be high, slow, and completely out of position. That could explain the rapid climb and subsequent dive. The configuration changes during these altitude excursions would have been critical. If they extended gear and flaps while climbing to 4,000 feet, the drag would have been enormous. The aircraft would have slowed to near stall speed. The engines would have been screaming trying to maintain altitude. Then, when they needed to descend, they'd have no energy left to trade.
They basically fall out of the sky. The gear and flaps that were supposed to help them land would become anchors, dragging them down with no way to recover. What's particularly telling is that the altitude fluctuations stop about 2 minutes before impact. The final data points show a steady descent toward the ground. That suggests whatever was causing the erratic readings, whether mechanical or atmospheric, resolved itself. But by then, it was too late. They were too low, too slow, too far gone to recover. The aircraft was configured for landing, but had no energy to reach the runway. They were committed to hitting whatever was in front of them. Trees, ground, whatever physics decided. The NTSB preliminary report will hopefully clarify this altitude mystery. They have radar data, cockpit voice recordings, and flight data recorder information that we don't. They can tell us definitively whether the citation climbed to 4,000 feet or whether it was all sensor errors. They can tell us what the pilots were saying during these altitude excursions. They can paint a complete picture of what happened. But until then, we're left with this confusing data that suggests something extraordinary happened in those middle minutes of the flight. The families of those on board probably wonder about this data too. Did their loved ones experience a violent climb and dive? Were they thrown around the cabin? Were they aware of how desperate the situation was? Or was it all instrument error and the flight path was actually smooth until those final moments? These aren't just technical questions. They're human questions about the final experiences of people we've lost. The altitude data isn't just numbers. It represents real moments of real people in a real aircraft fighting for their real lives. Aviation accidents are rarely simple. They're usually combinations of factors that align in the worst possible way. The altitude fluctuations in the Biffle crash data might be showing us that complexity. Multiple failures, compounding problems, cascading emergencies, each one making the next one worse. The climb to 4,000 feet, if real, might have been an attempt to solve one problem that created 3 new problems. The descent might have been recovery from one emergency that led directly into another. The erratic path might be the visual representation of task saturation. Too many problems, too little time, too few solutions. What we can say for certain is that the altitude data shows chaos. Whether that chaos was real or electronic doesn't matter as much as what it represents. A crew overwhelmed, systems failing, options disappearing, time running out. The numbers might be wrong, but the story they tell is probably right. This wasn't a simple engine failure with a controlled return to the airport. This was something worse. Something that pushed experienced pilots beyond their capabilities. Something that turned a routine flight into a tragedy in just 10 minutes. The Citation II's altitude capabilities at maximum weight are marginal even with both engines. Single-engine ceiling is probably below 10,000 feet, maybe as low as 8,000 on a hot day. Add in the drag of an open baggage door, if that's what happened. Add in gear and flaps extended. Add in the panic of an emergency. The aircraft simply couldn't climb to 4,000 feet under those conditions. Unless the weight calculations were wrong. Unless they were lighter than reported. Unless both engines were actually working and something else was the problem. So many possibilities, so few certainties. As I study this altitude data, I keep coming back to one thought. These weren't just numbers on a screen. These were real people in a real aircraft experiencing something terrifying. Whether they climbed to 4,000 feet or stayed at 2,000, they were fighting for their lives. Whether the data is accurate or corrupted, it represents human beings in crisis. Dennis trying to control the aircraft, Jack trying to communicate, Greg and his family hoping for a safe landing. 7 people whose final minutes are reduced to confusing altitude plots that we're still trying to understand. The truth about those altitude fluctuations might never be fully known. Even with all the NTSB's resources, some questions remain unanswered. Was it real? Was it instrument error? Was it atmospheric anomaly? Was it data corruption?
Maybe it was all of these. Maybe the truth is more complex than any single explanation. Maybe those wild altitude swings represent not one problem, but many. Not one failure, but cascading disasters. Not one story, but 7 individual tragedies happening simultaneously in a small jet over North Carolina. Thank you all for watching. This altitude data has puzzled me since the day it was released. The idea that a Citation II could climb 4,000 feet per minute under those conditions seems impossible. But impossible things sometimes happen in aviation. Sometimes the data shows us things that shouldn't exist but do. Sometimes the numbers tell stories we don't want to believe but must. Whether that climb to 4,000 feet was real or phantom, it represents something important.
It shows us that we still don't fully understand what happened in those 10 minutes. We may never fully understand, but we keep analyzing, keep questioning, keep trying to learn. Because somewhere out there, another Citation is flying. Another crew is dealing with problems. Another family is trusting that the aircraft will bring them home. And maybe understanding these impossible altitude fluctuations will help prevent the next tragedy. Maybe these confusing numbers will save lives. Maybe Greg Biffle's final flight data, as mysterious as it is, will teach us something that matters. We'll see you at the checkered flag.